Moving to Whispering Pines was supposed to be a fresh start for Jacob and Emily. After years of living in a bustling city, they longed for the peace and serenity of a quiet, remote home. When they found the large, picturesque house nestled in the forest, it seemed too perfect to be true. The house was surrounded by towering pine trees, and a gentle breeze always seemed to carry the soft sound of rustling needles. The property was spacious, with a long, winding driveway that gave them all the privacy they could ever need. It was a bit older than they had originally wanted, but the charm of the house quickly won them over. The wooden beams, vintage fixtures, and large stone fireplace gave it a cozy, warm feeling. Exactly what they had been searching for. The realtor had mentioned the house's previous owners had moved out quickly and left it fully furnished, but that didn't seem to bother them. It only made the move-in process easier. As they unpacked their belongings, the excitement of their new life began to take over. But it didn't take long before strange things started happening. It began small, the occasional creak or groan of the house, which they initially chalked up to the house settling. However, the noises grew louder at night, especially around 3 a.m. It was always the same, a thumping sound from upstairs, followed by a soft whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Jacob and Emily tried to ignore it. After all, it was an old house, and old houses made strange noises. But soon, the whispers became louder and more distinct. They couldn't understand what was being said, but it was clear that it was more than just the house's creaking. One night, Emily woke Jacob up in a panic. She had heard footsteps in the hallway outside their bedroom. Jacob, thinking it was just her imagination, got up to check. As he opened the bedroom door, he was greeted with an eerie silence. The hallway was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier. He quickly shut the door, telling Emily it was nothing, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Days turned into weeks and the whispers persisted. They were always faint, as though someone was talking just out of earshot. The couple tried to ignore them, focusing on settling into their new life. Emily began redecorating, adding her personal touches to the old house. Jacob spent his time working on projects around the property, making small repairs and tending to the garden. But as they made the house their own, the occurrences became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, Emily was alone in the living room when she heard a soft voice calling her name. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. She froze, her heart racing. The voice came again, this time louder. It sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Emily," the voice whispered, sending chills down her spine. She jumped up, looking around the room, but there was no one there. The voice continued, repeating her name over and over again. She ran upstairs to find Jacob, her breath quick and shallow. But when they searched the house together, they found nothing out of the ordinary. As the days went by, the whispers became more intense, almost as if they were angry. They no longer called her name, but instead the soft murmur of unintelligible words filled the house, especially at night. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the faint sound of voices. Jacob, ever the rational thinker, tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was the wind passing through cracks in the walls, or perhaps old pipes creating the noise. But Emily knew deep down that it was something else. There was something, or someone, in the house with them. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, Jacob noticed something strange about one of the doors upstairs. It was a small, nondescript door at the end of the hallway, one they had never bothered to open. When they first moved in, it had been locked, and they hadn't thought much of it. But now Jacob was curious. He grabbed a screwdriver and began working on the old lock. After several minutes of struggling, the door finally creaked open. What they found inside sent a wave of unease through both of them. It was a small, dusty room, completely bare except for a single wooden chair positioned in the center. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that neither of them recognized. On the floor, surrounding the chair, was a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for what seemed like years. But what caught their attention most was the ceiling. There were deep, claw-like scratches, as if someone or something had desperately tried to escape. Emily felt her stomach turn. "What is this place?" she whispered. Jacob didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the strange symbols on the walls, trying to make sense of them. They were crude and uneven, but they seemed purposeful, like some kind of ancient script. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house changed. The once cozy and inviting home now felt oppressive, like it was closing in on them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the strange thumping noises that had once been occasional now happened every night without fail. The night after they discovered the room, Emily was awoken by the sound of heavy breathing coming from the corner of their bedroom. She sat up, her heart racing, and saw a dark figure standing in the shadows near the window. "Jacob," she whispered, shaking him awake. Jacob groggily opened his eyes and followed her gaze. The figure was tall, with long, twisted limbs and glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It stood motionless, staring at them. For a moment neither of them moved, frozen in terror. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, unable to sleep. The next morning they contacted a local historian to see if they could learn more about the house. What they discovered was chilling. The house had been built in the early 1800s by a wealthy landowner who was rumored to be involved in dark rituals. Over the years, several families had lived in the house, but many had fled after experiencing strange occurrences. There were even stories of a former resident who had gone mad, claiming to hear voices and see figures in the shadows. He had locked himself in the small room at the end of the hallway, carving strange symbols into the walls in an attempt to protect himself. He was never seen again. As the days went by, Jacob and Emily's fear turned into desperation. They couldn't stay in the house any longer, but every time they tried to leave, something stopped them. Their car wouldn't start. Strange accidents would happen and they would hear the whispers even outside the house. The entity's presence became stronger, more aggressive. Emily began having vivid nightmares in which she was trapped in the small room, the symbols on the walls glowing with a sinister light as the figure with glowing eyes stood over her. Jacob, once the rational one, began to lose his grip on reality. He spent hours staring at the symbols they had found in the locked room, muttering to himself. Emily feared that he was starting to fall under the same spell as the previous resident who had gone mad. One night, after yet another terrifying encounter with the dark figure, they decided to confront it once and for all. Armed with sage, candles, and holy water, they prepared for a cleansing ritual they had found online. But as they began the ritual, the house erupted into chaos. Doors slammed, windows shattered, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of malevolence. The dark figure appeared once again, but this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the walls, surrounding Jacob and Emily. In a desperate bid to save themselves, Emily threw the holy water at the figures, causing them to hiss and recoil. She grabbed Jacob's hand, pulling him towards the door. The house seemed to fight them at every step, but they managed to make it outside. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted, and the whispers ceased. They didn't look back as they ran to their car, which miraculously started this time. They drove away from Whispering Pines, vowing never to return. But even miles away from the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The dark figure with the glowing eyes haunted their dreams, and the whispers continued to echo in their minds, a reminder that some things are never truly left behind. Alyssa had been excited about moving into her new home. It was her first time living alone, and after years of cramped apartments, the spacious two-story house felt like a dream come true. Nestled on a quiet street, surrounded by trees and tranquility, it seemed perfect. The house had been on the market for a while, and although Alyssa found this odd, the low price made her overlook any hesitation. The realtor had assured her it was just because people preferred newer homes in the area. Alyssa didn't mind. She loved the history and charm of old houses. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. Alyssa spent her time unpacking, arranging furniture, and making the house feel like her own. But by the end of the first week, strange things began to happen. She would hear soft creaks and taps at odd hours, and on a few occasions, she swore she heard faint breathing when she was alone in her bedroom at night. At first, she blamed it on the house settling. It was old after all, and with its wooden floors and walls, it wasn't unusual for it to creak. But as the days went by, the sounds became more frequent and unsettling. It wasn't just creaks anymore. There were distinct footsteps, heavy and slow, echoing through the hallways when no one else was there. Alyssa's heart would race every time she heard the noises. She tried to brush it off, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. One night, as Alyssa was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange. The door to the attic, which she hadn't used or even opened since moving in, was slightly ajar. She was sure it had been shut earlier. She hesitated at the bottom of the attic stairs, feeling a chill crawl down her spine. Mustering her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and slowly ascended the steps, her heart pounding in her chest. The attic was cold and dark, filled with dust-covered boxes left by the previous owner. As she shone her flashlight around, the beam caught something, a small wooden rocking chair, sitting in the far corner, gently moving back and forth. Alyssa froze. The window was closed and there was no breeze. Suddenly the air felt thick and Alyssa's legs turned to lead. She rushed back down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind her. She locked it even though she knew it wouldn't do much good if someone, or something, was up there. The rest of the night, Alyssa barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. One evening, while watching TV, Alyssa caught movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look down the hallway and saw a dark figure standing there. It was tall and indistinct, like a shadow, but it had a presence, something cold and menacing. Alyssa screamed, jumping up from the couch. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching her. She blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained, that heavy, oppressive sensation like something was still lurking in the house. A few days later, Alyssa received an anonymous letter in her mailbox. There was no return address and the envelope was plain. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message: "You're not alone." Her hands trembled as she read it. She looked around her front yard, half expecting to see someone watching her from the street, but it was empty. She called the police, but they couldn't do much other than note it down as a potential prank. Alyssa, however, felt anything but reassured. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. Items in her home would be moved when she wasn't looking. Keys she left on the kitchen counter would end up in the living room. Pictures on the wall would be slightly tilted. At night, she would wake up to the sound of footsteps right outside her bedroom door, followed by the soft creak of the attic stairs. Alyssa began to wonder if the previous owner had experienced similar things. Desperate for answers, she started digging through the house's history. She found out that the former occupant had mysteriously disappeared a few years ago, leaving the house abandoned for a long time before it went on the market. The more she learned, the more her fear grew. Something was wrong with this house. One evening, while watching TV, Alyssa caught movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look down the hallway and saw a dark figure standing there. It was tall and indistinct like a shadow, but it had a presence, something cold and menacing. Alyssa screamed, jumping up from the couch. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. She blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained, that heavy, oppressive sensation, like something was still lurking in the house. That night, Alyssa slept with all the lights on. The noises didn't stop. Footsteps echoed through the hallways. Doors creaked, and at one point she heard what sounded like whispering right outside her bedroom door. But when she opened it, there was no one there. She knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. The next morning, she packed a bag and decided to leave for a few days. But as she stepped outside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Scrawled across the front door in black paint were the words, "You can't leave." Panicked, Alyssa drove to the local library to do more research. She needed to know who had lived in the house before and what had happened to them. What she found was a collection of old newspaper clippings detailing a series of disappearances over the last century, all connected to her home. Each occupant had either vanished without a trace or fled in fear, leaving behind cryptic notes about strange occurrences and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The most disturbing detail was a photo from the 1950s of a woman who looked eerily like Alyssa, standing in front of the house. The headline read, "Local woman disappears. Last seen in Ridge Street house." Alyssa's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Each new occupant became the next victim, trapped by whatever dark force resided within its walls. She was next. Determined not to fall victim to the same fate, Alyssa returned to the house one last time. She armed herself with sage, holy water, and a determination to cleanse the house once and for all. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt it, the heavy, suffocating presence of something ancient and evil. The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. The attic door creaked open on its own, and from the darkness above, Alyssa could hear the soft sound of someone humming. She walked slowly towards the stairs, her heart pounding. As she reached the top of the steps, she saw it, the shadowy figure, more distinct now, standing in the middle of the room. It was watching her, waiting. Alyssa's hands shook as she raised the sage, but before she could begin the cleansing, the figure lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. The room spun, and Alyssa struggled to breathe as the dark presence seemed to wrap itself around her, crushing her under its weight. Just as she thought it was over, she grabbed the bottle of holy water from her pocket and threw it at the figure. There was a deafening screech, and the figure recoiled, dissolving into the shadows. The air in the room lifted and the oppressive feeling was gone. Alyssa scrambled to her feet and ran out of the house, never looking back. She moved far away from Ridge Street, vowing never to speak of the house again. But in the quiet of the night, she could still feel it, the eyes watching her from the shadows, waiting for their next chance. The old Victorian house sat at the end of Maplewood Street, a house that had been abandoned for decades before Ella and her family moved in. From the outside, it seemed picturesque, a dream home for anyone looking to escape the noise of the city. With its ornate woodwork, sprawling front yard, and towering windows, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. Ella, her husband Mark, and their two young children, Sophie and Max, had spent months searching for the perfect home. When they came across the listing for the Victorian house, they couldn't believe their luck. It was spacious, affordable, and had a charm that modern homes lacked. The only downside was its long history of being unoccupied. But that didn't bother them. In fact, they saw it as a chance to restore the house to its former glory. The move went smoothly. Over the next few weeks, they busied themselves with unpacking, painting, and getting settled. The kids loved running around the large backyard, and Ella enjoyed decorating each room to her liking. However, one room remained untouched. It was a small, windowless room on the second floor, tucked away at the end of the hall. The previous owners had left it locked, and when Ella asked about it, the realtor had merely shrugged, saying it had always been that way. At first, Ella didn't think much of it. There were plenty of other rooms to occupy their time, and with the hustle of moving, the locked door was easy to forget. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. Sophie, their 6-year-old daughter, started mentioning an imaginary friend she'd played with in the house. When Ella asked who this friend was, Sophie's answer was always the same. She lives in the quiet room. Ella brushed it off as a child's overactive imagination. After all, what 6-year-old didn't invent imaginary friends? But Sophie's insistence on referring to the locked room as the quiet room unsettled her. The next few weeks passed without much incident, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the house. The sounds at night were unusual. Not just the typical creaks of an old house settling, but something more deliberate. Footsteps would echo down the hallway, though no one was there. Sometimes she'd hear the sound of soft humming coming from somewhere within the house, but she could never pinpoint where it was coming from. One night, while putting Max to bed, Ella heard Sophie talking to someone in her room. When she walked in, Sophie was sitting on her bed, facing the corner. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Ella preguntó, tratando de ocultar la inquietud en su voz. Sophie turned to her with a wide smile. "My friend from the quiet room. She says she's sad." Ella's heart skipped a beat. "Why is she sad?" "She says she doesn't like being alone anymore," Sophie replied, her voice a soft whisper. Trying to dismiss the growing anxiety, Ella kissed Sophie goodnight and left the room. As she walked down the hall, she couldn't help but glance at the door to the locked room. It stood there, silent and unassuming, but now it seemed ominous, as though it was waiting for something. Later that night, Ella mentioned Sophie's imaginary friend to Mark. He laughed it off, telling her it was normal for kids to invent stories when they moved into a new house. But Ella couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next day, she found Sophie sitting outside the locked room, her tiny hand pressed against the door. "She's crying again, Mommy," Sophie said softly. "Ella se arrodilló al lado de ella." "Who's crying, sweetheart?" "My friend. She says she's stuck." Ella couldn't take it anymore. The locked room had begun to consume her thoughts. Why had the previous owners left it locked? And why was Sophie so fixated on it? That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ella went to the basement to search for a key. After rummaging through old boxes and drawers, she finally found it. A small, rusty key labeled "Quiet Room." Her hands trembled as she climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. She reached the door and inserted the key into the lock. With a soft click, the door creaked open. The room was small and dark, just as she had imagined. There was no furniture, no windows, nothing but the cold, empty walls. But as she stepped inside, she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as if the very air in the room was thick with sorrow. Ella shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as she backed out of the room and closed the door. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old house were absent, as though the entire structure was holding its breath. Ella lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had just unleashed. In the days that followed, things took a darker turn. The once faint humming that Ella had occasionally heard now became louder, and it wasn't just humming anymore. It was a voice, low and mournful, whispering words she couldn't understand. Sophie began waking up in the middle of the night, crying and telling Ella that her friend was angry. "She says we shouldn't have opened the door," Sophie said one night, her eyes wide with fear. Ella's heart sank. She knew something was wrong with the house. She had felt it the moment she stepped into the quiet room. But now, it was as if the house itself was coming alive with a malevolent energy. Objects began to move on their own. Lights flickered, doors slammed shut without warning, and the once cozy home became a place of fear and anxiety. Mark, who had always been skeptical, started to believe that something was wrong. He too began hearing the strange noises and feeling the eerie presence that seemed to follow them around the house. One night while lying in bed, they both heard it, a voice, clear as day, coming from the quiet room. "Get out," it whispered. Terrified, Ella and Mark knew they had to do something. They called in a paranormal investigator, a woman named Claire who had experience dealing with haunted houses. Claire arrived the next day, equipped with tools and cameras to capture any paranormal activity. As she walked through the house, Claire immediately sensed the dark energy that lingered in the air. When she reached the quiet room, she stopped, her face paling. "There's something here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something angry. They set up cameras throughout the house, especially around the quiet room. That night, they stayed up watching the monitors, waiting for something to happen. At first, the house was eerily silent. But then, just after midnight, the monitors began to flicker. The camera outside the quiet room caught movement. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, standing just inside the doorway. Claire gasped. "That's it," she said. "That's what's been haunting this house." But as they watched, the figure turned towards the camera. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes dark and empty. And then, it spoke. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." Determined to rid the house of the entity, Claire prepared for a cleansing ritual the next day. She warned Ella and Mark that it wouldn't be easy, and that the entity would likely resist, but it was their only option. The ritual began that evening, with Claire lighting candles and burning sage throughout the house. She recited ancient incantations meant to banish the spirit, but as she did, the house seemed to fight back. The walls shook, doors slammed, and a chilling wind swept through the halls, even though all the windows were closed. Sophie screamed as she clung to Ella, while Max hid under a blanket, trembling in fear. As Claire moved towards the quiet room, the energy in the house grew more intense. The air felt thick and the temperature dropped suddenly. The door to the quiet room flung open on its own, revealing the shadowy figure standing in the center, watching them with those cold, hollow eyes. Claire stood her ground, continuing the ritual, her voice growing louder and more forceful with each word. The figure seemed to flicker and waver, as if struggling to maintain its form. "You don't belong here," Claire shouted. "You must leave this place." For a moment it seemed as though the entity was weakening. The house stopped shaking and the wind died down, but then the figure lunged at Claire, letting out a guttural scream that shook them to their core. Claire fell to the ground, gasping for breath as the candles around her extinguished in an instant. Ella couldn't stand by any longer. She knew that somehow this entity had latched onto Sophie's innocent mind, using her as a conduit. She grabbed Sophie's hand and marched towards the quiet room, her heart racing but filled with a fierce determination to protect her family. "Sophie, you need to tell your friend that it's time to go," Ella whispered, kneeling down to face her daughter. "She can't stay here anymore." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked into the dark room. "She's scared, Mommy. She doesn't want to be alone." Ella's heart broke at the thought of this lost soul, trapped for who knows how long in this place of torment. "We're going to help her," she said gently, "but she has to move on." Sophie took a deep breath, then turned towards the room. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to be scared anymore. You can go." The figure paused, its form wavering again. Slowly it began to dissolve, its dark, hollow eyes softening as it faded into the shadows. The room grew still, and the oppressive weight that had lingered in the house seemed to lift. The next morning, the house was peaceful. The strange noises had stopped, the air was lighter, and for the first time in weeks, Ella felt like they could finally call this place home. Claire assured them that the spirit was gone, released from its torment, thanks to Sophie's innocent connection with it. Ella and Mark decided to keep the quiet room locked, not out of fear, but out of respect for the spirit that had once been trapped there. They would never forget the events that had transpired in the house, but they knew that they were safe now, and the spirit had found peace. As they settled back into their lives, Ella couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. The house, once a place of fear, was now filled with warmth and love. And though they would always remember the quiet room, they knew that it would never be haunted again. Rebecca and David had always dreamed of living in the countryside, away from the bustling noise of the city. So, when they found an old farmhouse nestled deep in the rolling hills, it seemed like the perfect place to start a new chapter. The house was large, with creaking wooden floors and sprawling fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It had been abandoned for years, but they saw potential in its rustic charm. The previous owners had left behind a few pieces of furniture, most of which were old and unusable. But there was one item in particular that caught Rebecca's attention: a large, antique wardrobe that stood in the corner of their new bedroom. It was an intricately carved piece, made of dark oak with brass handles shaped like lion heads. Something about it intrigued her, though she couldn't quite place why. "Looks like it's been locked for a long time," David said, trying to open it but finding the doors firmly sealed. "That's strange," Rebecca murmured, running her fingers along the grooves of the wood. "Why would they leave it locked?" David shrugged. "Probably just junk inside. We'll get a locksmith to open it later." Despite its foreboding presence, Rebecca couldn't stop herself from thinking about the wardrobe. At night, she would lie in bed, staring at it in the moonlight. There was something about it that felt off. As the days passed, she started to hear soft creaking noises coming from inside the wardrobe, as if something was shifting within it. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling, but soon the noises grew louder. There were soft thuds, scratches, and the faintest whispering sounds, like a breeze blowing through a crack. Rebecca's unease grew, but David brushed it off as paranoia. One evening, while cleaning out the attic, Rebecca found an old wooden box tucked behind a pile of dusty furniture. Inside was an assortment of old tools, broken trinkets, and, at the very bottom, a small brass key. It was old, tarnished, and yet it seemed to have some significance. Rebecca couldn't help but feel drawn to it, the weight of it cool in her palm. The moment she touched the key, a chill ran down her spine, but she quickly shook off the feeling. Could this be the key to the wardrobe? The thought crossed her mind, and despite her growing sense of dread, she decided to try it. That night, after David had gone to bed, she took the key to the wardrobe. Her hands trembled as she inserted it into the lock. With a soft click, the door slowly creaked open, revealing the dark, musty interior. At first glance, the wardrobe appeared empty, except for a thick layer of dust. But as Rebecca reached inside, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled out an old, weathered mirror, its glass fogged and the frame covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. As she held the mirror up to the light, a faint reflection appeared. It wasn't her own face, though. It was someone else staring back at her with wide, hollow eyes. Terrified, Rebecca dropped the mirror, watching as it hit the wooden floor with a loud crash. The glass didn't break, but the reflection vanished, leaving only her own startled face staring back at her. "Rebecca, what was that?" David called from the bed, half asleep. "Nothing, just the wardrobe," she stammered, quickly shoving the mirror back inside and slamming the wardrobe door shut. She lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. The image of the strange face in the mirror haunted her thoughts. Who was that? And why had it appeared in the wardrobe? As much as she tried to push the incident out of her mind, a deep sense of unease settled in her chest. Over the next few days, the noises coming from the wardrobe intensified. The creaking grew louder, and sometimes Rebecca could swear she heard whispers, just on the edge of hearing, as if someone was speaking from the other side of the door. One night, while David was working late, Rebecca sat alone in the living room, reading a book to distract herself from the growing sense of dread. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. Her heart leapt into her throat as she raced up the stairs, stopping outside the bedroom door. The wardrobe door was ajar. It had opened on its own. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in place, staring at the open wardrobe. A cold draft seemed to spill out from within, chilling the room. Slowly, she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the darkness inside. From the shadows, something moved. A figure, tall, thin, and wrapped in dark, tattered clothing, stepped out of the wardrobe. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Rebecca could feel its gaze on her, heavy and oppressive. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was paralyzed, as though the very air around her had thickened. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "You shouldn't have opened it," a voice hissed, though the figure's mouth never moved. The voice was inside her head, cold and whispery, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Rebecca stumbled backward, her legs finally obeying her as she bolted out of the room and down the stairs. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed David's number. "David, come home," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something in the house." David rushed home, but by the time he arrived, the figure had disappeared, leaving only the open wardrobe and the cold chill in the air. Rebecca tried to explain what had happened, but David was skeptical, blaming it on stress from the move and the isolation of the countryside. But Rebecca knew what she had seen. Over the next few days, the figure returned. It would emerge from the wardrobe in the dead of night, standing at the foot of their bed, watching them as they slept. Rebecca woke up several times to find it hovering near her, its presence suffocating. She tried to scream, but every time her voice failed her, as though the entity had control over her very breath. David, though still doubtful, couldn't deny that something strange was happening. The wardrobe had become a portal of sorts, allowing the entity to cross over into their world. And it was getting stronger. One evening, while David was fixing something in the kitchen, Rebecca heard a loud crash from upstairs. She ran to the bedroom only to find the wardrobe wide open and the room in disarray. The mirror she had found inside had been thrown across the room, and strange symbols were scrawled across the walls in what looked like soot or ash. The entity was angry. Desperate to rid their home of the malevolent spirit, Rebecca and David sought help from a local paranormal expert. The woman, an older lady named Evelyn, had experience dealing with haunted objects and agreed to help cleanse the wardrobe. Evelyn arrived with candles, herbs, and ancient incantations, warning Rebecca and David that this would not be an easy task. The entity was powerful, and it would fight to stay connected to their world. As Evelyn began the cleansing ritual, the air in the room grew thick with tension. The wardrobe doors rattled violently, and the entire house seemed to shake. The figure appeared again, emerging from the shadows, more tangible and menacing than ever before. "You cannot banish me," the voice echoed through the room, shaking the walls as though the very house was speaking. But Evelyn stood firm, chanting louder and more forcefully, her hands moving through the air as she drew symbols of protection. The entity let out an ear-piercing scream, its form flickering as it tried to resist the banishment. But as Evelyn's incantations grew in power, the entity began to weaken. With a final, desperate wail, the figure was sucked back into the wardrobe, and the doors slammed shut with a deafening thud. Evelyn turned to Rebecca and David, exhausted but victorious. "It's over," she said quietly. "But the wardrobe must remain locked, always." They did as she instructed, sealing the wardrobe for good and never speaking of the events again. Though the house was quiet once more, they would never forget the dark presence that had once lurked within their home, and the terror that had come with unlocking the wardrobe.